esteemed guests, fellow scholars, and distinguished audience. I stand before you today not only with gratitude, but with a sense of purpose. Before I share my reflections, I too must first acknowledge the lands on which we gather today. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the custodians of these lands, and their ancestors, past, present, and emerging. As we come together in this spirit of unity, let us remember the wisdom of Bunjil and the law of Wominjeka. With this word, the Wurundjeri people ask a simple request, that we come with purpose, and it is in that spirit that I come here and talk to you today.
So welcome to the 13th Renate Kamener Oration. The oration has now supported a dozen students through Ormond College and is fulfilling one of our mother's most cherished beliefs, that through education comes opportunity. Following from Noel Pearson last year, we're really excited to have Catherine Liddle as our orator this year. I'd like to acknowledge Professor Duncan Maskell, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, Lara McKay, the Master of Ormond College, Machina Watts, MP, a member of the Victorian Legislative Council for the Northern Metropolitan Region, and Barry Judd, Deputy Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor Indigenous at Melbourne University. Prior to Catherine's oration, the 2023 Renate Kamener Scholarship recipient, Guruji Wagner, will do the welcome to country and will say a few words, and Barry Judd will also say a few words. Barry is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous and Professor of Indigenous Studies in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne, and he plays a crucial role in shaping institutional policy, strategy and guidance on all aspects of Indigenous higher education. Guruji.
Thank you. My name is Guruji Wagner, and I am a proud Yidinji man from Gordonvale, far north Queensland. My academic journey as an emerging engineer has been marked by determination and a commitment to fostering engineering excellence. Now, you may wonder how I stumbled upon engineering, a field that I've come to appreciate and enjoy. I'm writing this speech. In writing this speech, I tried to find a childhood story where I observed engineering within my Yidinji culture. And while things do exist, my passion for engineering actually started with adventurous childhood pursuits like playing Lego, riding motorbikes, and admiring deadly helicopters. Little did I know that these playful endeavours would shape my passion for solving real-world problems. Fast forward to the day when I made the decision to pursue engineering. Armed with determination and eagerness to make a difference, at 15, I left my regional hometown of Gordonvale. For me, my younger brother Marley, and the rest of the mob, home isn't a place, it's a feeling. A deep sense of connection and belonging. That feeling of wide open sugarcane farms, freshwater creeks, and reeling in a barra on the reef on a tropical summer's day simply isn't the same as cold weather and grand sandstone castles, no matter how warm the fireplace or the friendships. As fate would have it, by attending a prestigious boarding school over 2,000 kilometres away, I became more engaged in both academic and extracurricular pursuits at a tertiary level. Through the encouragement and belief of my engineering teacher, I was inspired to follow in my father's footsteps. He was an aircraft engineer working on the Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters in the Australian Army. After some research, I discovered programs like the Victorian Indigenous Engineering Winter School, which provided an informative insight of what engineering is. For me, it hasn't been about crunching numbers or designing the state-of-the-art machine. It's been about finding solution that improves the lives of my people my country, and creating pathways that benefit everyone. When Aboriginal people enter the field of engineering, we bring a unique perspective that stems from our ancient connection to country and inherent understanding of sustainable practices. These perspectives, while overlooked for centuries, are now being implemented in our built environment, corporate governance frameworks, and participatory design processes. We envisage comprehensive and respectful engineering solutions that promote a more sustainable society. In engineering, we call this innovation. At home, we call it common sense. The support of Ormond College, the Kameners, and the scholarship program has played an important role in my journey as an emerging engineer. I'm grateful for this generosity and commend their belief in the contribution of First Nations engineers like myself. Over the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of working at leading engineering firms like BAE Systems and John Holland. Here I saw a growing presence of aspiring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engineers. This filled me with hope. But did you know, according to the industry's peak body, Engineers Australia, Indigenous people represent only 0.3% of Australia's professional engineers. These numbers require a 1,000% increase in order to reach parity. Engineering is but one of many well-respected and high-earning professions that leave a significant impact on the lives of all Australians, yet we see a chronic underrepresentation. We must ask ourselves, are we doing enough? Or more importantly, how can we be more ambitious? Imagine a world where our everyday experiences of the built environment, infrastructure, hospitals, schools, airports, reflect our unique and shared identity as a nation. One where 65,000 years of custodianship enhances the efficacy of biosciences. One where natural resources are managed sustainably in perpetuity. A world where the expertise of the Indigenous engineer is celebrated and heard loud and clear. We must value First Nations engineers, designers and decision makers, recognising the cruciality of this for our future. Now, as I shift gears, I'd like you to hold on to this ambition and principle in our shared story. The upcoming referendum and the proposed voice to Parliament represent far more than a mere policy initiative. It embodies a beacon of hope for the transformative and inclusive society. It goes beyond just one person or one community, representing a call for meaning consultation and representation in decision-making processes that affect our lives, our land, and Australia's shared future. This is an unprecedented opportunity to rectify historical injustices and healing. The voice is not just about symbolic gestures, but rather tangible change. We must actively listen to the diverse perspectives within our communities, valuing and integrating the wisdom, tradition, and as I'm sure Catherine Liddle will discuss, the experience of our peoples that have been passed down through generations. For too long, my people have been marginalised, overlooked and silenced, including our elders, grassroots community leaders, health practitioners, educators, elected officials, Royal Commission inquisitors and countless other incredibly wise people. Our First Nations leaders hold crucial knowledge and solutions, but on balance lack power and autonomy. Only through genuine engagement and shifting of colonial power structures can we address the social, economical and health disparities that continue to disproportionately affect my peoples. Once again, common sense must prevail, whereby decisions that affect us are informed by us. The voice is not merely an idea. It represents a turning point in our nation's history, a chance to mend fractures of the past and the promise of a stronger future for all Australians. It's an opportunity to rewrite our national narrative, embracing the richness of Indigenous knowledge, culture, and perspectives that are woven into the fabric of this land. In doing so, we strengthen our collective sense of identity as a nation. As an emerging leader, I see my role as an advocate for the voice and as a bridge between Indigenous perspectives and the broader engineering profession. I am committed to embedding Indigenous knowledge and principles into engineering practices, fostering solutions that respect my country and my culture. I hope that we can echo the same respect in our trusted decision-making processes. As I reflect on my journey and the significance of the voice, I am filled with the unwavering support as a sense of hope and determination. Equally, as I reflect on my pathway to becoming an engineer, I am confronted by the ways in which society often defines the ambition and ceiling of success for Indigenous people. I was told to finish high school. I was told to get a degree, while carrying the weight of history on my shoulders and embracing the strength of my ancestors, I have held up my end of the bargain. Now, I stand here instead asking you to support our own idea of success, a pathway to self-determination. This side of the bargain I offer you, stand alongside us, endorse our vision with your own voice. In the words of the great Wurundjeri leader and friend of the Jewish community, William Barak, we are all visitors to this time, this place. We are just passing through. Our purpose here is to observe, to learn, to grow, to love, and then we return home. As we move forward, let us remember this wisdom, the responsibility we hold to one another, and the call to act with purpose. Let us step forward together, as it is the opportunities we don't take that we most regret. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the oration.
Wow. Awesome. Really good. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome Barry Judd to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. I have nothing prepared, so we'll just see how we go. It's wonderful to see so many people turned out on a Sunday afternoon, evening to an event like this. It just shows the enormous amount of support for Indigenous students and people, and I'd like to start by thanking everybody. I would also like to start by acknowledging that we meet this evening on the unceded territory of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Also like to acknowledge the Indigenous people in the room, and most importantly Indigenous students of Ormond College, the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Maskell, Dr Maskell, his wife, and other VIPs who may be in the room this evening. This year, as everybody knows, is a very important reason for on several counts. One of those counts, I think, would be the University of Melbourne on the 16th of August will launch its new Indigenous strategy, Mirmak Jering, which is a Woiwurrung phrase that means working together. The new strategy steps out of the Reconciliation Action Plan framework that has directed the university's work for the past 15 years or so, not because the university is turning its back on the concept of reconciliation, but because we have outgrown that framework as an institution. The new strategy contains 21 signature activities across just about all of our faculties and contains a number of key themes, including the theme of leadership. It is a significant step change for the University of Melbourne and seeks to position us as a leader in our Indigenous activities. So I'm very honoured to be leading that particular initiative. That initiative rests on good leadership, and we're lucky enough to have a Vice-Chancellor who really believes in supporting our Indigenous education activities. We have many other people across the executive and senior leadership that do that. An issue for us, however, is that we need more Indigenous people leading to be part of the solution to this issue, which is why this oration and the scholarship that it supports is so important to the cause. And that I'm saying that in an institution that has 93 Indigenous academic staff. It's not enough when you consider the size of our university is up around 70,000 people as a total community. The other thing that's happening, of course, this year is The Voice. And talking about it may be wandering into the realm of politics, except to say that the Voice referendum is not a federal election. This is not a choice about voting for Labor or Liberal or the Nationals or the Greens or One Nation, dare I say it. This is far more important than that. This is a vote that will determine the future for our children, our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And at every opportunity I get now on social media and events like this, I'm advocating for The Voice and for people to consider the possibility that you might vote yes. Because we can't allow ourselves to be derailed into voting no because we lack the detail of what might happen in the future. If we take ourselves back to the 1890s when the various publics of the Australian colonies were considering the possibility of federation, no one really knew that one day in defence we'd be considering the possibility of building nuclear submarines in Australia, for example. So those who say that we need more detail, I think are wrong. This is about a political principle of whether Australian governments at Commonwealth level should, as a matter of process, listen to the voices of Indigenous Australians. And if you believe that, you should vote yes. Catherine, who's speaking today, has another name, Injiki, and she has that name because that was my grandmother's name. We're actually related through kinship. Our people come from Central Australia, and I guess I wanted to tell you this because it touches on another issue that has emerged during the referendum campaign, the idea that The Voice will only benefit middle-class Indigenous people. I think it's really important that we understand that the students who attend this college and this university now or in the past are privileged to a degree, but that privilege is very fragile, and none of us come from places of wealth. We actually come from places of stolen wealth. Catherine's family and mine are people who experienced life on cattle stations, and our grandparents and great-grandparents and even aunts and uncles are people who can remember working for rations on country that was theirs. So that's important, I think. I also wanted to mention that I think it's right to say that Catherine's grandmother was midwife to my mother's birth. And that didn't happen in a hospital. That happened on the banks of the Ewe River in Central Australia. Catherine's grandmother was an enormous person in law and culture in Central Australia. And when I was living in Alice Springs just a few years ago, there was an event at Congress, which is the health service in Alice Springs, and under Catherine's grandmother's tutorage, a number of Aboriginal women, I believe you might have been a dancer, were dancing a ceremonial song from the Simpson Desert. And that was the first time in probably 50 years such a ceremony had been performed in downtown Alice Springs. So Catherine comes to speak to you this evening from a place of real strength and connection, and a connection into the kind of communities the naysayers on The Voice say don't believe in yes. So it's a real privilege to be here to have some opening remarks before your oration, Catherine, and I'm sure that the audience will enjoy what you have to say about leadership. Thank you. Thank you.
So I was going to introduce Catherine, but I don't think I can beat that, Barry. That was just the most wonderful introduction to Catherine. But just very briefly, we're very privileged to have Catherine Liddle as our, to give this oration. This is the 13th, as Marty said, and I should say I'm Renate Kamener, Renate's other son. This is the 13th Renate Kamener Oration, and the third to be given by a First Nations leader, following on from Marcia Langton and Noel Pearson last year. Catherine is an Arrernte Luritja woman from Central Australia and is a leading advocate for upholding the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island children, focusing on influencing and driving positive change. As the CEO of SNAICC since 2021, which describes the national voice for our children, she works to strengthen, represent and amplify the voices of children and families. She is a key member of the Coalition of Peaks, as involved in ongoing work under the National Partnership Agreement on Closing the Gap. As Barry referred to, she spent most of her childhood in Alice Springs or Mbuntwe. She still spends time where she can escape her busy schedule back on country, singing the songlines, telling the stories, and maybe still dancing. Her leadership and commitment to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led partnerships and governance is critical to addressing the gaps and needs in children's early years. She is a firm believer in the power of Aboriginal community-controlled early childhood education and support services to change life outcomes and create better futures, not just for young ones, but for the entire community. Welcome, Catherine.
Hello everyone. What an incredible journey this has been to get to you today. I actually won't lie, I was a little bit scared and thinking, there's been some incredible speakers for this oration, and God, I hope I can hold my own. And we've mentioned my Nana a couple of times, and I dreamed about her on Wednesday night for the first time since she passed away. And she, as usual, had some very profound thoughts for me. And I saw her, I said, "Nana, is everything okay?" And she said, "Hey, listen here, you need to stop eating." Right, thanks for that, Nana. I knew my clothes were feeling a bit tight, but as is always my Nana's way, what she was telling me was something slightly different, and it was that I needed to care for myself and I needed to stop worrying about things. And what happened after that was, you know, I did that thing, I don't know if you've tried it, that tool for making yourself go to sleep when you're a bit overstressed. So breathe in for 4, hold for 7, breathe out for 8. So I did that 10 times. You're only supposed to need to do it 4. And after 10 times, I rolled over again, and then I went, you know, I'm awake. I'm going to work, because that's what you do to go to sleep. You start working again. And I opened up this email that I'd seen come in from Larry, and it said, "Oh, dear Catherine," and I know I'm paraphrasing, "I just wanted to alert you that we're changing venue." And I'm like, "Oh my God, this is going to be so embarrassing. No one's going to turn up." And he said, "Because the venue's too small." So I thought, thank you, Nana. She was waking me up for a reason, and she was saying, one of the things keeping you awake is not that you will not do the best you possibly can, but rather there's a reason to bring your best self, and what is coming will be worth it. So that being said, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Worimi people of the great Kulin nation. Jesus, more deadly. I know they say Womanjunka here. In my country they say Wurida. That is my grandfather's language, my Nana's language, and the same language that Uncle Barry's family speak. Well, they would say, "Nundupalya, you up good? Hello, I'm happy to be here." A huge thank you to the Kamener family. What an incredible gift to be given this platform. Wow. And I can only hope, after reading about your mother and hearing from her firsthand about her, I was like, God, geez, I hope I can bring my best. So I hope I do her memory honour in my conversations with you today. I'm incredibly honoured and incredibly humbled. When I was reading about your mum, and excuse me for not saying her name, it's a habit not to speak the names of people who've passed, so it's not that I don't want to say it, I don't have trouble bringing it forward. So when I was reading about her, I was really struck by something, and it was her ability to bring people into the room. And I think the phrase that most resonated with me, and this one I have to read, was how when bringing people together from different and varied groups, she would find common points of sunshine. How can anyone not relate to that? Common points of sunshine. And I think for me, part of the way my conversation with you all will go today is really based on that understanding of common points of sunshine. I'm hoping that what we do today is recognise that while we might walk in very, very different paths, we can work together to be catalysts for positive change in our own ways. We can determine how we do that. It's been absolutely, as I've said, overwhelming thinking about building up to this oration, because people who I've looked up to my entire life and been extraordinarily impressed by have stood here to talk to people like yourselves. And those people have included Marcia Langton, Professor Marcia Langton, oh my goodness. Noel Pearson, what an incredible orator. Julia Gillard, a former Prime Minister. These are incredible and remarkable people who all come into rooms like this with different perspectives and different ideologies and different ways of understanding how to move things and how to progress. So to think that I am standing in the same position that they might have stood in is really quite extraordinary, because I feel like, as Uncle Barry said, that I'm still a kid from the bush, which is where I grew up, in the bush. So when we talk about first-hand lived experience, I know what it's like to live without electricity. I know what it's like to live without access to a plumber or even a flushing toilet. I know what it's like to live in a box with no heating, and I know what it's like to share a shower and a toilet with minimum 30 other people. That was my lived experience. But I also reflect on those times, and I think they were some of the most extraordinary times of my life, and I am who I am today because of those wonderful experiences. And one of those revolves around, climbing windmills. Windmills were a big part of my life. There was no TV out there because you didn't run the electricity, and I don't think my nana and grandpa could have afforded a television in the first place. But I'd do things like I'd climb windmills, and I'd look at the birds. And this particular day, I saw a bird fall out of the sky. It must have been about 47 degrees, and when it's about 47 degrees, birds fall out of the sky. And I thought, I just got a message from Elvis Presley. I don't know how I made that, but anyhow, I did. So, and again, I suspect it's because when you grow up out bush, again, there's not a lot out there. So there was an old record player and one record that played Dolly Parton, and one tape, and that tape was from Elvis Presley, and it was Flaming Star. And I really wanted to be like this, Elvis. So I wrote a letter. I went and got the poor old birdie, and I wrote a letter to Elvis Presley. And it said, "Dear Elvis, I hope that one day when this bird reaches you, you can reach back down to me and give me your voice, because I want to sing like you." And it only occurred to me really today as I was sitting in the audience that maybe he heard me. I'm not sure I can sing like Elvis, but I certainly have a lot more voice than a kid growing up in the bush climbing windmills usually ever gets privileged to do. And a lot of that, as Uncle Barry has said, is because of the role of my nana and the role of those incredible old women, those incredible negotiators who said, "You have the cultural authority and delegation to speak for us. You are our dancer. You are our avatar. You will hold the akudras." For those of you who are not Indigenous, the akudras is where we house our ancestors. We don't speak about them much because they might get cross if we accidentally wake them up, and they've got to be woken up because they belong to everyone. While I might hold them, they belong to everyone. So I have to have the permission of a lot of different countrymen before I can wake them up and ask them to join me. I'll talk about that as we go along. I think the reason maybe all of these things are coming together at this moment in time is because we're at this incredible fork in the road, and both Uncle Barry and Orrente spoke to this. We've got an opportunity that may never come again in anybody's lifetime, and if we miss it, chances are none of us will be alive to see it come again. More importantly, what we're looking at this moment in time might define the future for not only our children, but their children as well. It's going to be a future, hopefully, where we recognise, celebrate and hear the knowledge from a remarkable 60,000 years of history that we share collectively. It's a decision that every single one of us here, people we know and people who we don't know, are going to have to make in the not too distant future. My hope is that Australians are open to listening, that they're open to hearing solutions. I think Guruji said it really well when he said that they're open to common sense. And I'm going to thank you, because I was really wondering how I might wrap this up, and listening to the opening comments, I now know how I'm going to finish. I never really know until I stand up here, to be perfectly honest. And it was an awesome reminder of this incredible history we have on this land where sovereignty was never ceded. What an incredible legacy to have as an Australian people, First Nations people. Land that was never ceded. As mentioned, my name is Injiki. I'm named for the trees. So it's old language. If anyone's familiar with our songs and dances, they are so old that the language no longer exists. So people often ask, what does Injiki mean? Well, that language is so old, we actually don't know what that word means anymore. But we do know that it places me in a lineage, so that when we do ceremony, I say I'm Injiki, everyone knows who my nana was and who my grandmother was, who their grandmothers were and who they have been for generations. I have not learnt that skill yet to identify the names, but when I walk with my nanas and I sit with my nanas, and in this life with my nana now gone, I sit with Uncle Barry's mum, Nana Lorna, as my primary nana. And everyone knows that that's where I sit and that's where I sing and that's who I dance for and that's who I learn from. It is an incredible tool of identifying who you are and where you've come from. And again, while I think of that name, it was an incredible privilege to be given it. My name should have been Dangawana, and that is the name of my nana's mother, my Pibi. So in our language, in our ways, my Pibi is my daughter. But being born in the 70s, my nana was not comfortable giving me that name because she thought that I would be unfairly targeted if I had my black name. So we waited until it was time, and the name they gave me was Indiki. Nana Alice is the other name we knew her by. She was an extraordinary woman, couldn't speak a word English. Couldn't speak a word of English, but she'd come to visit us when we were in town. She always knew when we were in town. And again, she lived on the mission block. And she didn't have a lot. Nana Alice had very little. And when she'd come, without fail, she'd come bearing a gift. And for me and Evie. And we used to say to Nana, Nana, how come we always get presents from Nana Alice? And she said, because you have to learn that she's your PB and your job is to look after her. But she looks after you now. And one day it will be your responsibility to make sure she's okay. My favourite gift from Nana Alice was this round radio. She told us radio. And we could never get this radio to work. So it was sort of round and it had, like little lights on it when you pressed it. And when you pressed it, it would go honk, honk. And we couldn't work this radio out. And we tried to make this radio work for years and years and years. Until one day as an adult, I found that radio in the back of my nana's house and worked out it wasn't a radio, it was a bike horn. That poor old girl would have spent so much money on that bike horn because she wanted a radio for us as her PBs. And it shows you that incredible generosity that our old people have. So it is a great gift to be called Indiki, to be given that name. That name is the connection to my country. It grounds me in who I am, and it's at the very core of everything I understand about how the world operates. It's why I will always fight for our children to have the opportunity to know who they are and where they belong to, because these stories are so incredible. Connection to country, to culture, and to kin is everything to us. If you're not familiar with our law, there's two ways. One sits with men, and one sits with women. The women's side is called grandmother's law, and it's very old. It's incredible. It prioritises children, and at the heart of it is this: if all children are loved as though they are your own, if all children are fed, if all children know where to go to when they feel unsafe, then all children will be well. 60,000 years before the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have always understood that if you have a healthy community, you have healthy children and you raise your children as a village. It's interesting that we learn about these things today because it's just so inherent with the ways that we do it. Unlike Western systems, our children actually genuinely don't belong to mum and dad. They belong to their families and they belong to their communities. And there's multiple families, so you might not have one mum and dad, you might have 20 mums and dads. So technically, Uncle Barry over here is actually a father. And old ways I would be calling him Dad. And he would have to look after me, so I can quite rightly hit him up for money after this. You can see, he's thinking she's not really joking. We also had all those nanas and all those grandpas. There was always somewhere to go to. And me, and I, like a lot of my siblings and cousins, we spent a lot of time growing up with our nanas and grandpas. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, but we never felt unloved. We always felt like we belonged and we were always cherished. One thing we know about our nanas and our grandmothers and this particular law is our grandmothers are the storytellers. They are the masters of bringing the world to life. They are the masters at teaching us how to learn, how to interact, and how to fit in with the world around us. It's an innate understanding of the power of story, the treasure of knowledge, the law held by our elders, And I believe this is something that we probably share with the Jewish people, and I think that that's really synonymous with the gift that it is to speak on behalf of someone who fought very strongly for her community and the values of that community. Our understanding that our grandparents are special, that our communities are special. I think I'm also doubly privileged because I myself am a grandmother, and I had the awesome privilege last night of getting a FaceTime from my 1-year-old grandson who has just learnt some new words. And it comes to life, and he does that thing where babies are really proud of what they're going to tell you and a little bit humble at the same time, and he looks into the camera, he says, "Nana, I did a poo-poo." And then he clapped himself. That was his brand new words, and it was just so wonderful to hear the joy of a child learning how to use language, and the humility that he brought in bringing that language and that story to life for me. As previously said, I'm also the granddaughter of one of the most extraordinary women to ever live. My nana was minimum 96 when she died. We don't 100% know how old she was because you didn't register children in those days, because if you registered your children, you could be assured that you wouldn't have them anymore. So we think she's around 96, we know she's over 96-year-old when she passed. And the way she would describe herself, which was very, very true, was older than anyone. So her ways of knowing and being were a lot older than a lot of what we understand today. And the things she saw were quite incredible. She remembers walking around nakedy in the bush. She remembers what it was like to work for rations, but not only have to work for those rations, to then be asked to go and find food for everybody else, which you'd then hand off to the station keepers to be distributed. And again, these were things that she did from the time she was born. What she tells us is that she worked from the time she could walk. And the way that worked was that there was a stream down from the cattle station that she lived in, and she would carry a pannikin, and all the little kids would carry a pannikin, because even little toddlers can carry pannikins of water back to the homestead so that there was enough water. From the time she could ride a horse, she was expected to work like a man, and she did. One of the greatest horse riders ever. And it's quite a remarkable thing in these times, because when people talk about my grandfather, they often say, greatest cattleman ever. They often say he was a horse whisperer. And my nana, when she'd hear those things, would close one eye and she'd look up and she'd go, "I seen that man fall off a horse." Again, what that meant was, I'm a much better horse rider than Arthur Liddle ever was. She worked until the day she died. Incredible, incredible woman, not only as an artist, but as someone that people from around the world would come to visit. And she'd sit there, and sometimes she'd talk, and sometimes she wouldn't, because again, she was old. And what she understood is there are certain times you speak, and there are certain times when you will listen. And you know what? She also worked out that what she held in her brain was incredible IP, and she wasn't going to give it to just anyone. She was negotiating, she was doing deals, she was undertaking ceremony to keep relationships balanced and reciprocal. It's what we call napaji, which basically means I give you something, you give me something. I always find the interpretation of that really hard, because it sounds sort of transactional when it's not. It's much more nuanced than that. It means I value you and you value me, and if we share, we can find a common path. It's two-way learning. You hear that sometimes, two-way learning. It's finding the common points of sunshine. As I'm sure you've gathered, I don't mind a story, so I'm going to apologise if I go over time, because I'm also a really bad timekeeper. I've told you a little bit about who I am and where I'm from, but I should also tell you about the remarkable work that I do with SNAICC, this incredible organisation, the national peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. I pinch myself every day to think that there is a collection of people from across the country, because that's how the CEO is appointed, that said that is the person that we want to be able to walk into rooms and represent one of the biggest Aboriginal community controlled sectors in the country. For reference, I think we've mentioned the Coalition of Peaks. I'm Deputy Convener of the Coalition of Peaks. 80 different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled sectors represented through the Coalition of Peaks. Some of those have memberships of more than 20,000 people per organisation, not per peak, per organisation. Every single one of them has signed up to the Yes campaign. Times it by 80. It's an extraordinary number of people and an extraordinary delegation to have. We advocate to all levels of government about what we know keeps our children, our young people, our families safe and strong and connected to culture. A large part of what we do is about strengthening the layers of support for services around children that prevent them from coming into contact with out-of-home care systems or child protection in general. We do this work because Australia doesn't have a very good track record when it comes to the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. In fact, it's pretty bloody horrific. The stolen generation is just one of those. But when you go down south I say down south because I'm from the Territory, but if you head to the east, those beautiful golden beaches at Bondi, where they buried those children in the sand and played polo with their heads. On my country, not far from where I grew up, Bosun's Hut, the holes in the rocks where they stood the children up and they shot them one by one in front of their parents. This is Australia's history. The stealing of our children from their mothers. My grandfather cried every night, and as he died, he told us the bastard had blue eyes. Never forgot the bastard had blue eyes. There's no recognition of this horror, and there's no recognition of our incredibly rich culture. In fact, what we were told was to be ashamed of who we are, ashamed of your families, particularly those children who were stolen, and told to assimilate. I always think about that word assimilation when I watch Star Trek and you see the cyborgs, and I think, my goodness, that's what assimilation is. It's easy to hear it as a word. It's a whole other thing when you think about it. Be something that you're not. Become us, because we are better. This is a horrible history. And yet at the same time, we have a beautiful history. Our little ones are the only children on the world that can say they belong to the oldest continuing culture in the world. They are also the only children in Australia who can say that every building, as beautiful as they are, that every law, that every policy, that every institution, that every road was built to be put on top of their own world, their own ways of knowing, being and doing, to erode their existence. The only children in Australia that can say that. Before colonisation, we had no child protection systems. We didn't need it. And we didn't have jails. And don't get me wrong, the punishment for rape was murder. You were killed. And I often think about that because people confuse what happened 200 years ago with how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people might be today. But 200 years ago, capital punishment existed in the non-Indigenous communities as well, and still does in many communities today. But what does certainly still exist today is if a woman is the victim of rape, they're considered an unreliable witness and punished for bringing people to account. Sometimes their stories are dragged out through the media. They're asked to defend their positions, to relive those stories. I often think about what truly is barbaric. So 42 years ago, SNAICC was established to fight for recognition of the knowledges that we hold, of the love and the law for our children and our families. It was established because we recognised that without a voice, we were never going to be able to influence government policies and programs, and we'd never be able to change the trajectory for our children. Over the years, we've fought very hard and we've taken this very, very seriously. Some of our big wins include successfully lobbying for the Royal Commission into the stolen generations. That was the work of SNAICC based on the calls from our families. We also worked with every state and territory to implement in legislation, the child placement principle, the Aboriginal child placement principle, again, something that is currently under attack, even though every single government recognised its extraordinary ability to put children in safe environments, to keep them safe, to protect them from harm. More recently, we've seen the federal government step up to our calls to start getting rid of the activity test. The activity test that says unless you can work full time, you can't access well-subsidised, high-quality early education and care. So those families who need this support the most are unable to access it. We are the only sector to have had this win. The reforms are a good step. Some of these things, you know, the idea is good, and we know that there's really goodwill, but we know a lot more needs to be done to improve it. We know that that movement, though, for change has always come from community, from the powerful voices and the experiences of children and young people, our families and our communities. This is our driving force. This is what keeps us coming into rooms like this, because it's our mission to amplify those voices, to connect it to stories that resonate with people in every single room that we walk into. We know that access to high quality early education holds the greatest potential for children. Everyone knows this, it's common sense. And we know that placing Aboriginal children with Aboriginal people gets the best outcomes, because it's based on our ways of knowing, our ways of understanding. We know that we get different results. I'm going to very quickly show you the video. That's my homelands, by the way. I'll come back to that. Forgot about that. This is Yappara, right? So there's two of these centres in Melbourne. One's called Yappara and the other one's called Bubba William. They're called multifunctional Aboriginal community controlled services. That's a lot of words, so I'm going to let them tell you themselves what it actually means to belong to one of these services.
No one knows what Aboriginal people need better than Aboriginal people.
That's why Yappara works. That's why it's special.
Yappara is run by the Aboriginal community,
where the children learn from aunties and uncles.
In a place that nurtures our culture.
It helps our kids to understand their identity.
It makes them feel proud of who they are.
They learn through play.
They get the chance to develop things
like social skills, their speech,
and even how to manage their emotions.
Which means when they start primary school,
they're resilient and confident.
They're settled into a routine and they're ready to learn.
All Aboriginal children should have access to a place like Yappara.
A place by them, for them.
That sets them up to thrive.
And one of the reasons I love it is because when I look at it from my perspective, I tell the story of the rivers. And again, it's really critical to understanding why we need more of these services and why they need to be place-based. So when I was growing up, when the rains would come, it was always the story. It was always the start of the stories, and people start moving. And the old girls, they'd gather us all up, and it was back in the days, and if you've noticed I've changed microphones, it's just because I found this one a little bit distracting. So I feel like I'm free. I can move around a little bit. I feel like more of myself. Anyhow, the old girls, they used to round us up in a ute, and back in those days you could fit 20 kids in the back of a ute. Apparently it's not safe. We loved it. And they'd drive along at about 10 kilometres an hour because they're old grannies. And we'd get to the rivers, and the very first thing the older children would do, and they'd do it, including myself, before the ute would even stop. You'd jump off the ute and you'd start running, because no one wants to be told what to do. And if that ute stopped and you were still in the back of the ute, those old girls would be telling you what to do. And as young people, our job was to run and start the fire. Critical to learning how to start a fire, because learning how to start a fire can save your life in the bush. But it also means that you are caring for the people around you. In particular, you're caring for the nanas, because poor things, they're too old to go and pick up all those sticks and light the fires. And so you'd light the fire and you'd start boiling the kettle or the billy. And while we were doing those things, you needed water for that billy, So the little ones would go by the side of the river and they'd dig a soakage. And again, some of you might know this already, but if you don't, when a river's flowing, it's not only flowing where you can see it, it's flowing under the ground as well. So if you move slightly to either side of the bank, probably about a metre in, and you start digging, what you get is filtered water. So the little ones, because this is good fun, would dig the holes and pull out the water. And using those pannikins, they'd bring it back to the billy and start boiling the water for the nanas. They were teaching the young ones how to find water. They were teaching the young ones to care for their elders. While that was happening, the older children, the ones slightly older, they'd be throwing the sticks into the river and watching where they went, because that would show you where the currents were, and that would show you if there was something in the way. And when the nanas weren't looking, what we'd do is we'd go and look for those where the sticks would get sucked underwater, and then we'd run alongside it, count the number of seconds to see before it re-emerged. And then we'd check with a bigger stick to make sure there was nothing blocking the path. And then we'd check to see where the nanas were watching, and then we'd jump in the water and take a risk and get sucked down by those currents and spat out the other way. Invariably, the nanas would catch on. I told you this was a thing of risk, right? And they'd see us and they'd pick up another stick, this one for us, and they'd walk up and down the edge of the river, because we were going to get in big trouble for doing stupid things. And what it actually taught us was it was a waiting game. And so as older children, what you'd do was be weighing up, can your legs outlast your nana's legs while you tread water? Again, teaching you how to take risks. While that was happening, your punishment for that obviously would be to come back and look after the kids, because they'd eventually run out of legs, and you wouldn't get that hiding, but it was enough that you got the threat. And we'd go back and we'd look after the young ones, and the nanas would teach us how to pull out a headache. They'd teach us how to throw it away. They'd teach us how to massage the babies so that they felt warm. And that is what these services offer. It's a modern context of it, but it's that way of understanding how everyone has a role in raising children, and everyone learns differently, and everybody has to take their place for all these things to happen. And in and amongst it, of course, is critical life skills, critical stories, and the ability to learn how to take a risk or two. We know that these things work, and they've worked for a very, very long time. This is where I moved my finger and can't find my notes anymore. It won't take me long. We know that one of the reasons we've been unable to access services like this is because somewhere along the line, with no evaluation of these services whatsoever, $500 million was cut from front-end service delivery to children and families. $500 million. Now, that wasn't only our childcare centres. That got a really special hit. That got a hit of $80 million on top of the $500 million. All these beautiful centres almost wiped out overnight. Alongside it came the policy change that said unless you had 2 working parents, you couldn't access it. And here comes the catch-22. We can't build you a childcare centre because there's no houses out there to house a teacher, and there's no roads to get teachers out anyway. And we know this, and we've known this for 20 years, but we're still not going to build that centre. But we can invest in areas where everyone has a house to live in, and everyone has a road, and everyone's got a car. But you people living in the bush, that's just too costly. This speaks to exclusion and discrimination, and it speaks to the disproportionate number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families living below the poverty line, creating barriers to accessing awesome services like Yaburara. And yet it's well known that increasing a child's opportunities in the early years is the foundation to success. Again, one of the things that we fought really hard for with the Coalition of the Peaks and the new agreement on closing the gap, and again, if you're not familiar with these things, they're 2 different things. The closing the gap targets, government implemented them 10 years ago, and then they came up with a refresh and they put it towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the Peaks in particular, who said, yeah, nah, let's have a conversation about what you're really measuring. And when it came to early childhood development, the measure that had been put in place, of course, was preschool attendance. So all the dollars that the government was going to invest, all the reforms that the governments were going to invest in, without asking Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, were going to be preschool. And this was based on evidence, technically based on evidence. And that evidence showed that if you go to preschool, chances are you're going to go to high school, chances are you're going to go to university. The problem with that data set, and not asking Aboriginal people about that data set, is it belonged to middle class Australians. At less than 3% of the population, we didn't even show up in the statistics. We weren't a wrinkle. What was actually true for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and what was known by the Aboriginal community, was in actual fact, if you look at the early learning developmental domains, at that point in time, only 30% of our children were on track in all 5 domains. It's pretty much the same today. So we were able to negotiate with government to put in a new target, and that is to concentrate on children being ready for preschool and being culturally strong enough to enter into rooms and institutions where for the first time they are going to experience something that they have never experienced before, and that is not the cultural safety of their homes. For the first time, they need to be ready to be able to walk into those rooms and understand that they are proud of who they are. The community consultation that underpinned a lot of this was tied to a thing we call the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Early Years Strategy. Sounds a bit familiar to some consultations going on at the moment, an ongoing little bugbear of mine. So this consultation, basically, again, driven by SNAICC, said to government, the problem we're having is our children don't sit in government departments. Our children are the responsibility of all government departments. So until you can find a way to show up to the table and invest in our children, we're going to continue to have these problems. So after nearly 3 years of consultation, we came up with that particular framework. Guess what happened then? The government changed. That's a good government, we're not complaining. They take it seriously, but the first thing they did was start consulting on a brand new early years strategy to go straight over the top of the one we'd already designed. Again, just another example of what happens when governments change. Affordability continues to be a massive factor, and I've talked about the need for the removal of the activity test, because this is what communities told us without fail. It's not that our children don't want to attend these centres, they either don't exist or we can't afford them. We want our children to thrive. An example of what poverty looks like can be seen in the Northern Territory, Numbulwar. That's just one community, this is just one example. The average weekly income for a family in Numbulwar is $642. The Northern Territory poverty line is $842. Without a subsidy to attend an early childhood service, you've got no chance of being able to afford it at $80 a day. And that's before you go and pay for your pumpkin that costs $40 for a pumpkin. This affordability barrier or poverty barrier has been around for a long time and known about for a long time. It prevents access to childcare, and yet it is a massive battle to get it removed. And again, a massive catch-22, because at the end of the day, when you're less than 3% of the population, your vote doesn't count. There are no votes in Indigenous affairs unless you've got a political agenda. And we'll come back to that in a minute. The answers to breaking down these barriers, of course, lie in the strengths of our families. And we know the strengths of our services, those services that our elders identified we need and fought for so hard. We know that those responses need to include fields like maternal and child health, housing, early education and care, disability, family safety, and promoting cultural identity and development. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations play a vital role in all of this because they are based on what the community needs. We continue to work really hard to press government to use every single lever they have to start changing this, to start putting dollars where the dollars should be, to put policy and programs in the hands of people who understand what impacts those policies and programs are going to have on them. We need to re-examine everything that we've done in the past and base it on what Aboriginal people have actually experienced. Great idea to centralise all your government services. Great idea, huge efficiency. Awesome idea of that $500 million cut. Just not so good if you live in a remote community and you don't have a car and you can't afford $5 a litre for fuel to get into town because your Centrelink's just been cut off and the public phone doesn't work and your mobile phones don't work because you don't have telecommunications in that region or internet connectivity. And even if you did have an internet connectivity, it wouldn't work because digital inclusion requires you to understand how to read English. And you didn't have a school, so you can't read or write. It means that the traditional social determinants, including housing, employment, education and neighbourhood quality, also need to be addressed concurrently. There's an urgent need to address the unique social determinants of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander well-being, including the persistent experience of racism. It's an ugly word and it's an uncomfortable word, and if it makes you squirm, I certainly understand it. But we know that the best placed people to understand where the unconscious bias is our own mob. We know that we need more of what we've seen in Yappara. The other really interesting thing about these services is that the moment you stand them up, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people start coming looking for work, and yet we hear that there's no jobs in communities. But up they come. Imagine the jobs that these services could provide. Imagine if Dad was the walking train to school. Imagine if Mum was doing the cooking. Imagine if Nana was planning the excursions. Imagine if your big sister came and read to you after school, creating the ambition of more early childhood services. Again, something that we can still push for, but something that doesn't happen yet. Now, more than ever, we really need to be taking action. We need to be looking for every single opportunity we can find for our children to thrive. Because with all the progress, with all the action, there's something really ugly happening at the moment, and it's pretty malevolent. And again, it's going to make you uncomfortable, because that malevolent presence is pretty much in every corner of government, and it's called racism, and it's so often yielded as a weapon. Now, that's not saying that individuals are racist. Let me be very clear on that. There's two different things being talked about here. But here's what I know. I lived through the Northern Territory intervention, when our families were called useless and hapless, when our brothers and our fathers and our uncles and our grandfathers were called pedophiles, when we got the letters that told us that our children needed to be presented to doctors for examination to check if they'd been sexually abused. At the time, all Aboriginal communities said this story is a lie. The story is a lie, it is unfounded, and no one listened. And yet still, our children had to present en masse for examination. Our community controlled programs were again stripped away. CDEP, where families on communities had said, we don't want the dole, we want to be able to work, we want to be able to help our communities. Simple programs, things like care for elders, where young people would, again, using our traditional ways of knowing and being, would be paid in line with the CDEP with a little top-up, because they were self-generating income, to go around to the nanas and make sure they had food, make sure they had toilet paper. Or up on the top end, where Groote Island had 50 micro businesses, each self-generating, gone overnight and replaced with a new reform, a better reform by government, called CDP, which meant you had to work for the dole and you could go and paint a rock. And I'm not joking. Not, let's train you to be a painter. Let's give you, all those places out bush, they need painting too. Let's make you work all day painting rocks around your community. And we'll continue to pay $2,000 just to get a painter to community. That's just the travel. That's before they do the work that they do. We lived through that, and we still feel the burden of that. The other impact of that point in time was that fathers were so scared they stopped cuddling their children. Big brothers stopped playing with little brothers. It was invasive. It was disempowering, and we still feel the pain. As it turned out, as I said, the accusations were untrue. We've seen it happen just recently in my hometown of Alice Springs. Those accusations came back again. And let me be very clear, child sexual abuse is horrific. and should never be excused. It is inexcusable. And anyone telling you that it doesn't exist in any community is lying, because every community in Australia faces horrific demons like this one. But the stats don't measure up. The evidence doesn't measure up. And an example of that is at the same time Alice Springs was being hit with calls for yet another Royal Commission, and we've had 3, let me be very clear on that, 3 Royal Commissions. Each one of them said invest in communities, empower families. The Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse identified that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were more likely to be sexually abused in out-of-home care and childhood institutions than in their family. It is different to what we see in the mainstream population. The same week we had calls to remove more children from their families instead of invest in the architecture and infrastructure that families need to be successful. The national study on the maltreatment of Australia's children was released, and the stats are horrific. The number of Australian children that are victims of child sexual abuse is a national disgrace. And when you look at those numbers again, we're tiny. Those numbers don't represent our community. They represent everybody's communities. It's harmful, it's hurtful, and it's damn right wrong. But I'm sure you've all seen the feeds. This is what we should actually be saying no to. That type of behaviour is what we should all be standing up and saying no to. I do have a slide here from SNAICC, and again, when they announced the campaign for Yes 23, our board came together very quickly, our council came together very quickly and said, as the national voice for Australia's children, how can you not lean in hard and lean in as hard as you can? I'm sorry, I've taken that down, haven't I? But essentially what it says is that we will amplify our voice. We will come together and we will fight hard on this. And again, one of the most incredible things about it is so incredibly hard to stand up in front of people and argue for this, because often what comes next is a momentum of vile behaviour. And I'll give you an example of that. When we called out that SNAICC has been calling for a National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Commissioner for over 10 years to investigate what is going on with our children, to investigate child protection systems that when we do the studies on them shows that sometimes 70% of the children in the child protection system shouldn't have been there in the first place. 70% shouldn't have been there in the first place. When we call for those things, they're rejected time and time again. When we put that post up, we were hit with AI bots. Every single post that called that to account, that told that truth, 260 vile and negative comments. Anyone who shared that post hit by 260 vile, malevolent, malicious comments. That is what it takes to stand up. That is what it takes to hold governments or people to account. I'm not going to do much more platforming on that one because that malevolent presence doesn't need any more platform than it already has. When it comes to the Uluru Statement, I've been on a bit of a journey, to be perfectly honest. I had other things to do, as Uncle Barry said. I was more interested in restoring a story that's been missing for 50 years. My nana was old. We had to come around and we had to save it. And so I was at home doing ceremony. I'm not taking much notice of this, and I got this call from this bloke called Thomas Mayo, and he said, "Can I come and talk to you about this Uluru Statement?" I said, "Oh yeah, what do you want to talk about?" He said, "I want to show it to you." I said, "Well, yeah, how are you going to do that?" He said, "I'm going to bring it. Can you get your family together?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'll ring up my nana and grandpa and I'll ring up all the aunties." "Sure, no worries," because that's what you do when someone not from your country turns up. And so he turns up, and I tell all the aunties, "This bloke, Thomas Mayo's coming to visit." And they go, "Oh yeah, who's he?" I said, "Well, he's from Darwin." "Oh, who's his mob?" I said, "Oh, no, he says he's a Mayo, hey?" And they go, "Oh, all right. You're going to make scones?" And I said to him, "Yeah, I'm going to make scones." I said to me, "You're going to make sultana scones?" I said, "No, I'm not going to make sultana scones." They go, "Oh, that's good. I don't like sultana scones." Next one. "Who's this bloke?" I said, "His name's Thomas Mayo." They go, "Oh, who's this Thomas Mayo?" I said, you know, like the mayos up the top end. Oh, top end. You're going to make scones? I said, yeah, I'll make scones. And they said, oh, okay. You're going to make pumpkin scones? I said, no, I don't like pumpkin scones. They said, that's good, we don't like them either. It went on like this for quite some time. Anyhow, they all turn up to my house and they're sitting around and it starts again. Catherine, who's this bloke? I said, oh, his name's Thomas Mayer. And they go, oh, okay. But it's a bit different now. They go, what's he going to do? I said, he wants to show us this thing called the Uluru Statement. And they go, oh, how's he going to do that? I said, I don't know. Must be a computer, hey? And they go, oh, yeah, all right. No worries. You got apricot jam? I said, no, I don't have apricot jam. Oh, that's good. We don't like apricot jam. Anyhow, we're going around and round in circles. This is our way. And we hear this knock at the door. Now, this is one of the most incredible things I have ever experienced. And again, I'm a person that does ceremony, so I recognise when the ancestors have arrived. And there's this knock on the door, and I'm in the kitchen. The nanas are in front of me over here, around the table, eating their scones, drinking their cups of tea. And down this way is my hallway, and there's a silhouette. And there's this person called Thomas Mayer. And I don't know if you've ever seen Thomas Mayer in person, but in silhouette, that is the fine figure of a warrior. So he's 6 foot, he's filled the frame, and next to him is this thing, even bigger than Thomas Mayer. I'm like, oh my goodness, what's coming to the door? And the nanas around the corner, they can't even see what I'm seeing. They go, oh my goodness, Catherine, what's happening? I said, I don't know. And they go, I think the ancestors have come. And everyone starts to whisper. And I walk down the corridor and I let in this bloke called Thomas Mayer, and he walks in, walks down the hallway, walks up to the grannies. He goes, hello. And they go, oh, who's your mum? He said, Thomas Mayer. I'm a Mayer. Ah, where are you from? He says, I'm from the top end. Oh, all right. And they're bouncing around because they know something quite extraordinary is about to happen. He says, I want to talk to you about this Uluru Statement. Can I show it to you? And everyone's like looking around because this is a little bit overwhelming. We don't know what we're looking at. And they go, yeah, how are you going to do that on the computer? Like the elephant in the room isn't this giant cylinder standing next to him. And he pulls out the Uluru Statement and he lays it on the ground. And every single one of us could hear the heart beating. The most extraordinary thing I have ever experienced. It was beating, and we looked at the names and the signatures of those people that represented communities from around Australia. Each of them a representative, not there in their individual right, a representative. Some of them the smartest people in the country. There were their hopes and their ambitions. I went, you know what? I might have to pay a little bit more attention to this Uluru Statement thing. But still, I had other things to do. Like ceremony, and I noted it, but I had to go out to Murrujulu the next day. So again, my Nana's father was a man called Gunagana, and Gunagana was the senior man for Uluru, and so we to this day we're considered 7 as 7. There's 2 groups of 7 traditional owners inside the national park. You like that one? National park, major political institution is what it really is, Uluru. Major political institution where our laws and our trees stand. Anyway, we're coming back from that, and something really weird started to happen, and I promise you this is my last story. We're looking out the window, well, Nana's looking out the window and she's singing. I love it when she sings, I can't hear that voice anymore. And I'm looking at the road, which is where my eyes need to be, and she says, hey, listen here. Yeah, what, old girl? Look out the window. And I look to the left. And there's this giant sandstorm, 30,000 feet in the air. I can tell it's 30,000 feet because I grew up out bush, so I know what height the aeroplanes are. And I go, oh, what's that? Sandstorm. And she goes, did you really look? I said, oh, woman, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm trying to drive a car. She said, look out the window again. What way is the wind blowing? And the wind was blowing this way. And she said, notice anything else? I said, yeah, I noticed a road and a car doing 110 kilometres an hour. And she said, hey, dumb person, look in front of you and the wind's going this way. And she said, anything else? I said, what? She said, look out the other window and the wind's going this way. She said, notice anything else out that window? I said, what? And she said, look further. And so I looked towards Mount Connor, and there is another wall about 30,000 feet in the air. Something a bit weird happening here, hey? Sandstorm there, disappears, sandstorm over there. Something weird is happening. Wind's going that way, wind's going that way, wind's going that way, and the car's starting to go like this. As it goes like this, the sky changes colour, and it goes from this beautiful clear blue to this incredible glowing fluorescent green, sometimes yellow, sometimes a little bit of red. And as we're looking at the sky changing colour, the wind starts to rock a bit more, and this giant rainbow forms, again 10 kilometres in the sky, one on top of the other, this incredible rainbow. And Nana says, Wanapee has arrived. Wanapee is the rainbow serpent, and you don't see him very often. And she says, we got to get out of here, and we got to get out of here fast. So we floor it, and we're a little bit scared about this because it's a road travelled by tourists, and they're a little bit scary, those drivers. and we don't get too far before the hail hits us. And this is a hailstorm like I have never experienced in my life. And we are getting smashed. The car's getting, this is a Land Cruiser, right? It is rocking from side to side. And she says, because she knows everything, that old girl, just slow down, I'll tell you when to stop. She knows where she is in space and time. So we slow down and she says, stop here, we'll be safe. And we're getting smashed by this storm. Smash, smash, smash. Arrernte is roaring. That giant serpent in the sky is roaring. Anyhow, we're there for about, 30 seconds, and the car stops doing this and starts going like this. Flash flood. It's hit us, and we have to get out of there. So she says, go slow, put it in 4-wheel drive, I'll take you to safety, because my Nana knows everything. And so we drive for a little bit further until she works out that we're high enough that the flash flood can't get us. And we sit there. And I asked my Nana to press record on this iPhone. I say, Nana, you've got to record this. No one's going to believe this thing happened. And she goes, why? Well, Wanapee, he'll come back again. Might be 50 years, but Wanapee will come again. Anyhow, it finally finishes. And when it finishes, that giant rainbow is still there, the same one we drove into. And she looks at it and she says, oh, that poor rainbow. It worked really hard to stop the rain. I said, what do you mean? I said, we were always taught, Nana, that rainbows come after rain. And again, she looks at me and she says, dumb person. Everybody knows rainbows stop the rain. Rainbows stop Wanapee. I said, oh, not everyone. And she said, every little kid is told that story. Every little kid should know when Wanapee is coming. Every little kid should know when Wanapee hits the sky and hits the underground channels and travels under the ground and appears 20 kilometres away in the sky again, something massive is about to happen. Every little kid, except the dumb people, they know this story. I said, oh, okay. And then we start to drive away. And I said, Nana, did you get that video? She goes, yeah, no worries, I got that video. So we drive and Wanapee hits us again, because that's how Wanapee comes. He comes in cycles. And we end up sleeping underneath this thing called Kungamamu, which is where the devil woman is. But she's our story, so we're safe. And we sit through the storm, sleep in the car overnight, and in the morning we get into town. And everyone's waiting for us, terrified that we've been, fallen off a cliff or something, because we were supposed to be back the night before, but the roads were too dangerous for anyone to come looking. Anyhow, we sit down and we go, no, we want to tell you the story. Let's show you the video. Nana got the video. And we press the video. We got 10 minutes of Nana's thumb. And I looked at that old girl who knows everything. And I smiled. And I said, you know what? Who's the dumb person now? Now, the reason I tell you the story of Wanampi, that giant serpent in the sky, is because that is a framework for understanding things. What those old people understand is that when you see Wanampi, things are going to change. Things will never be the same again. He cuts a new path. He destroys roads. He changes the shape of rivers. He wipes out houses. Things are never the same. He hasn't only changed what you see at the surface level, he's changed what sits underneath it. He's replenished the reservoirs. He's filled the water holes. And here's the other thing with Wanampi. He comes back again. And he comes back bigger, and he comes back stronger. And again, this time, when he's finished, well, the landscape never ever looks the same. You get to play in the mud once it's finished. Quite an extraordinary way of understanding change. What comes next might not look different, might not be the same, but it's always better. Now, I know I talked to you a little bit about my grandfather, who was stolen and who cried himself to sleep every single night. And he used to tell us, as he cried for his mum, the way he got through it was to look into the dark and say, I can't see what's there, but there's nothing out there that can hurt me. So I think that's where I'm going to leave you, to be perfectly honest, to say Wanampi is here. Wanampi is in our sky. Wanampi is sweeping through our communities, and Wanampi is beneath our feet. He is frightening. He is frightening and he is scary because we don't know what he's going to do, and we haven't seen the landscape afterwards. But we will get the chance to rebuild, and we will get the chance to play in the mud, and we will get the chance to have those reservoirs restored. And I'll leave you again with my grandfather's words. You don't need to be scared of what you can't see, because there's nothing here that's going to hurt you. Thank you.
Fabulous community leader. It did go longer than we agreed,
Yeah.
but I think it was absolutely worth it. That was mesmerising. If people have to go, we'll understand it, but we'll take a few questions and then we can continue the discussion over tea and coffee. But we'll just take maybe 3 or 4 questions from the floor. Who would like to kick off? Or we can just go and have tea. Harold.
Hi, I'm Harold Dwyer. I'm sort of interested in the idea that SNAICC has this dialogue with government.
Yes.
And perhaps sometimes successfully having policy that benefits and sometimes perhaps not.
Yeah.
But given that there is quite a deal of interaction between Indigenous organisations and government.
Yep.
How does the voice itself benefit
Yes.
the existing situation?
Yeah. Look, an example of that would be, so the way the peaks work is we remove the barriers. So the policy barriers, it's technical work, it's a lot of work. It's something that the voice will not, one would imagine, have the ability to do, because it's technical, it's massive. You know, you've got to have, several peaks with several bodies in them to be able to do that. But when we go and consult, so there's a couple of ways it could work. What I know is at this point in time where you need to go into Alice Springs and deal with something that everyone's known about for a long time. We know every single summer people come into town and they get stuck there. We know that every single summer we see an increase and spike in juveniles on the street. We see an increase in spike in violence. We see an increase in spike in break-ins. And yet every year, nothing is done to respond to it. If you had a voice at that point in time, that voice would have been able to work with its peak bodies, say someone like SNAICC, and say, SNAICC, can you go and lean in and talk to government and say this is what we need. Similarly, and that's at the regional and local level, similarly we then go and do the policy work, find out where the levers are, find out where the dollars are, find out how we can move these things really quickly, and you'd push that up to the more centralised body, one would imagine, and it then leans in on governments and says, come on, pull your finger out, essentially, pull your finger out. It also means that things like when we're talking about the activity test, people have been screaming about the impact of the activity test. An example of that would be Western Australia, where one of the multifunctional centres used to have 100% attendance every day and a waiting list of about 50, now operates at less than 40% because people can't afford to send their children there. And we screamed and we screamed and we screamed, and not only us but the mainstream sector screamed and screamed and screamed, and no one listened. The voice would have been able to say, show us the evidence, show us that that was a good idea to put the activity test in. Now, to be clear, theoretically, again it's an example of theoretically, the activity test was designed to get more middle class women into the workforce, back into the workforce. That's a great idea. Don't object to that in any way, shape or form. But they didn't consult with people on the ground, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people living on the poverty line or single mums, to say what would be the impact on you in the long term. A voice could stop that. A voice would say, you've got to take this seriously, this is what we're advising you on. And more importantly, and this is one of the critical structures of the voice, the government would have to make the consultation public. It would be known to voters if they didn't act on the advice. I hope that helps, sorry. There's so many different ways I could go on it.
Any other questions?
Catherine, thank you so much for sharing this story. Over time, I guess mine is not so much a question but a reflection. Sure. So, thank you. It's always wonderful over time, as I've heard your mum's story at Conception, right? Your mum told us a beautiful story, and it's a journey that we take with you. It isn't something that you say. And I guess my question perhaps is, apart from just sharing and learning and being part of the journey, and voting yes, which is a powerful thing that we could do, how else can we also amplify your voices?
How else do you amplify? Look, I think, again, it's about being interested and learning. It's about creating opportunities to walk into rooms like this one. It's about having that, for lack of a better term, seat at the table. Look, I know when we were getting hammered, absolutely hammered. It was relentless for about 4 weeks non-stop. And again, unprecedented, all our allies, the mainstream sector peak bodies leaning in and going, never seen anything like this, completely unprovoked attack. And that's the only way you could describe it. Every single one of those bodies, so the big NGOs stepped in and said something is wrong, the narrative here is wrong. They didn't have to do that because they knew that in standing up they probably were going to get hit by the bots as well. And they were really clever. They all stood up united. They released accounts, allied positions and those types of things. They turned off Twitter. They turned off comments on Facebook to stop things like those malevolent bots attacking. So there are multiple ways you could do it. At the community level, it's learning more about your own world and what might be there in your own environments. And it's being open to having really hard conversations, because when you use terms like racism, they're confronting, because there's the temptation that it's people saying you are a racist, which is different. It's different from what we're describing at this moment in time. So it's about having, at the personal level, a couple of really difficult conversations with family and friends sometimes. And if you want to know how difficult that is, I've got my father's side of the family all One Nation voters. So it's about finding the opportunity to lean in.
We'll take one more question if there is one.
Hi. So thank you so much. Really beautiful speech.
Thank you.
The history of Australia with referendum is very non-bipartisan support referendum passing,
Yeah.
which is really bad.
Yeah.
So there's going to be, let's say, 5-6 months, I don't think they've announced the date yet, between now and then, and the No campaign voices don't seem to want to listen in any way. So how do you get people who don't want to listen to understand the position that particularly you're taking as opposed to the broader Yes campaign?
Yeah, I think it's, again, that common points of sunshine. I had someone describe this to me when I first got to Melbourne, right, around that famous story of everyone trying to work out what to feed a cat, and the only person not sitting at the table was the owner of the cat. So it didn't matter how many times you came up with this new product, no one who understood it was in the room. And it was a conversation about diversity. And the person I was conversing with hates the word diversity because it doesn't sit with their ideology, but they described it in quantum mechanics. That's a bit interesting, hey? Having the different drivers in order to make it all work. So I think it is, again, if I lean into that common points of sunshine, at the end of the day, I think everyone wants a better outcome for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They just might not agree on how you get there. So how do you find that common point and find the language that helps people understand where it's at? A lot of it is fear, because a lot of the things that we're hearing, what do they call it, factoids, misinformation, it's actually intellectual dishonesty. So how do you break through something that is designed to terrify people when in actual fact it's for the good? It's about finding that common sunshine, finding a way to have a conversation that's different, and accepting that every now and then you're going to find someone who says no and they're never going to budge, and that's democracy, you know. Not everyone is always going to agree.
So do you think that forum is the media? What is that forum?
What is the forum? Look, I would love to see more balance in the media. Now, again, I don't know if it's the algorithms on my feeds, but as a general rule, as someone who has a long history in media, for every positive Indigenous story, you can expect a minimum of 5 negative stories. My feeds are smashed with negative stories. Again, as a journalist, what I can tell you is you create headlines that you know will resonate with people. And there's a level, I mean, I'm going to say it openly and honestly, there is a level of intellectual dishonesty in that. You create something that drives people to open it. So there is absolutely a role for media in it, but I just don't know how you... well, there is a role for media. Maybe the role is don't open half the media stories. Maybe that's what it is. And go and look for the information yourself. But again, in this world, even the so-called independent news feeds aren't necessarily independent. I think this is one where, as Australians, you've got to lean in and trust your own gut. Is this right? Is this common sense?
Okay. Can you all put your hands together for Catherine? We've had some great orations over the last 13 years, but rarely have we had 3 fabulous speeches. So thank you, Guruji, thank you, Barry, thank you, Catherine. That was really, I think, for all of us, an incredibly special insight into Indigenous wisdom from 60,000 years and how that interplays with today's society. That was wonderful. There is going to be tea and coffee if you want to stay and mingle. As has been mentioned, funds raised through the oration goes to fund scholarships for Indigenous students at Ormond, like Guruji and like the 12 others who've been before him. We see this as a way of building Indigenous leadership so that they can participate and influence outcomes in our society, taking account of Indigenous wisdom and making our country, our society a better place. So if you want to donate, I know there's things on your seat. You can either donate through the information there or you can speak to someone on your way out. But look, thanks everyone for coming. It's been a wonderful session. And there are some gifts. Thank you for reminding me. One for Barry. Catherine, there's a smaller one here for you, but there's a bigger one, which is like really big. I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to lift it properly, but hopefully we can get this back to you. So thank you. Thanks, everyone. Tea and coffee served. Thanks, Barry. That was
great.
It was
Great
great.
event.
All three of you were wonderful.